Good morning. It's News from the Roots on Mountain Stream TV. Today is Thursday, July 19th, 2018. I'm Avram Friedman, and we have Dr. Alan Lomax with us this morning. Hi, Alan. Thanks for coming in.
Good morning, Avram.
So this morning we're going to talk about an article that you brought up on the Occupy listserv yesterday.
Okay.
That's very interesting. It has to do with the media coverage of Russian interference with American elections in 2016 and maybe in 2018. Tell us a little bit about that article.
Well, the article was actually citing an article that was written by Kamowski and Steinman and several others, and actually a document that they had prepared that was actually stating that we don't need to be ratcheting up tensions between the U.S. and Russia, and that indeed, if in fact there was Russian interference in our electoral process, what we need to be looking at is actually the electoral process, because if Russia can interfere with our electoral process and actually manipulate the electoral process through hacking the machines, that what we need to be doing is actually looking at that whole electoral process. And that if Russia can interfere and can manipulate our voting process, then anybody else can do it. And in fact, I mean, you and I have had this conversation before. Computer science professionals have been telling us since the start of the use of electronic voting machines that these things are extraordinarily vulnerable to hacking, and that a slight manipulation of that can turn an election. And so it is very likely that since from the start of these electronic voting machines that our election process has been continuously hacked. And it's probably been more internally than externally. And this article was pointing out, the drafters of this article were stating that we need to look at that whole electoral process, that we need to secure the voting records to start with, and secondly, we have to have a paper trail for our electronic voting process so that we have a way and means of verifying elections. And in North Carolina, we do have that paper trail, but it's never utilized. We never go back and validate and verify. So what that article was saying, it was that twofold article. It was saying that we have got to ratchet down this tension between the United States and Russia. It's going to lead nowhere but to an all-out war between the United States and Russia, and that is going to lead to nuclear annihilation. Two nuclear powers in a war is not going to lead to anything good between anybody.
Well, so, I have many reactions to everything that you're saying, and I'm in total agreement with what you're saying. First of all, about Russia, I mean, it seems. I have no doubt that what's going on is real in terms of Russian interference in the American election. I think they did do it, but actually, I do have a contention here in that I don't think that Russia actually attempted to manipulate the voting machines. What we learned from the that whole debacle with the Democratic National Committee emails getting broken into, that was the so-called interference that Russia participated in the general election. They didn't actually manipulate the vote. They were trying to manipulate public opinion.
Right.
but they were doing so by revealing a reality that the Democratic National Committee, in essence, cheated.
And they didn't want to look at, yes.
And they talked about it on the email. They talked about how they manipulated the debate process. They talked about how they colluded with news networks in giving Hillary Clinton questions that were going to be asked at the debate, before the debate. You know, this all came out in Donna Brazil's book about how ashamed she was of the role that she played in the Democratic National Committee, and so.
And the superdelegates you didn't mention.
It's a sad fact that we had to find out from the Russians that our political system was being manipulated and probably illegally and at least unethically by the Democratic National Committee. And we didn't find out from our own news media because they were complicit in the manipulation of the election in that way. That being said, it's no small matter that Russia did try to manipulate our election, and both things are true. Both things are horrific. But my feeling was at the time, and is still, that the Democratic National Committee and the Clinton campaign used the Russian manipulation of the election to divert attention from what was going on in...
Right, exactly. I mean, I totally agree that they... they have used Russia to deflect from what they were doing.
And it's almost like they're willing to generate a whole new McCarthy era, you know, of fear of the Russians, and willing to risk war with Russia over something that didn't start in this election. I mean, the Russians have probably tried to influence public opinion in past elections as well. America has tried to influence elections in other countries, and every other country tries to influence. You know, I mean, this is just a geopolitical game that's going on all the time, but it's being highlighted now to divert attention from the DNC's horrific role in the 2016 election.
And what others have pointed out in terms of interference in our election. Russia is not the only one that does that. I mean, look at Saudi Arabia and the influence that they have, and how much influence they have upon our electoral process.
Right.
Is anybody looking at Saudi Arabia?
Right.
No, nobody's looking at Saudi Arabia and saying, "Oh, they've interfered with our election process," which they certainly have.
Right.
So, I mean, Russia is by far and away not the only one trying to manipulate our electoral process.
And gain advantage on the international level. And but this has been going on forever. This is nothing new. It's just being trumped up in this yellow journalistic frenzy.
Yeah. But, I mean, in terms of did they hack into our electoral process, I mean, we don't know. I mean, it looks like from what Mueller has that they probably
It's certainly possible that they did. Apparently they did attempt to, and maybe succeeded in hacking into some of the voter rolls, not the electronic voting machines themselves, although we don't, as you say, we don't know about that. But they did hack into the voting rolls in several major cities, and so got information on who's a Democrat, who's a Republican, what their voting records were, etc., which is frightening. It is frightening, but then we've left ourselves vulnerable to that by becoming so dependent on computers for our election processes. And getting back to the hacking of voting machines, that, as you say, has probably happened.
It's probably happening every election
as well, and we really don't know. Now, I went to see in 2000, after the 2004 election, in which there was this great question about, there's a recount in Ohio, and I actually went up to Ohio to observe the recount of that election, and we saw all kinds of irregularities and questioning, and they didn't actually have electronic voting machines in Ohio. They had electronic tabulating machines. It was a paper ballot, but it all went through electronic tabulating machines. And the question was whether the tabulating machines were hacked. And there were all kinds of irregularities pointing to the fact that indeed they had been hacked. When I got back, the North Carolina General Assembly was in the process of examining this. We were in the process, the whole state was in the process of transforming to electronic voting at that point. And the General Assembly had a joint committee of the Senate and the House, consisting of about 30 members of the Senate and the House. And they invited a professional hacker to come and speak to them about the dangers of electronic voting, because they generally wanted to see what an expert had to say. And I observed this. I actually was in Raleigh at the time by coincidence, and I decided to go and observe this committee meeting. And the presentation that he gave was absolutely frightening. He showed us step by step how in 5 minutes you could completely change the results of an election. And every one of those 30 members on the committee sat there speechless with their mouths agape. I mean, this was very impressive, and it led they didn't follow the advice of the hacker, who said that and incidentally, he said, "I am a Republican." He is a staunch Republican. He said, but the results and he admitted that the results of the election in 2004 were falsified by electronic voter hacking. And he said that voting machines, computers should have no part in the election process. That was his conclusion after examining the voting process with electronic voting machines. He said computers are wonderful tools for businesses and for personal use. They're very efficient, they're fast, they can make tasks, you can do multitasking with them and all this thing. And the purpose of a computer is speed and to increase efficiency. Those are not the qualities you're looking for in a voting machine: speed and efficiency. What you're looking for is accuracy and verifiability. And electronic voting machines do the opposite of that. What they do is make an election completely unverifiable, because you can program an electronic machine to forget what it did yesterday, so that an election can be hacked today, change the results of the election, and when you examine the machine tomorrow, all traces of that programming can be made to disappear. And everybody listened to him, and everybody was impressed. But when they took it back to the full body of the House and the Senate, who hadn't seen the presentation, what they decided on was a compromise in which they would create a so-called paper trail. Yeah. The problem with the paper trail that they've created is that it's basically the same thing as like a cash register roll, like a toilet paper roll,
Exactly.
And the only way to count that is with an electronic tabulator. So you feed it through an electronic tabulator and it comes out with a result.
Well, that doesn't help, yeah.
Right, because the tabulator can be rigged as well.
Right.
And the traditional way of counting votes is you have members of all parties present as the votes are being counted, hand counted, and then it's verifiable because you know everybody's observed it. You cannot do that with electronic voting machines or with the paper trail that it provides. It's virtually impossible. I mean, it would take forever. You'd have to pass each one to each, and that isn't done. They just use an electronic.
Well, you could get, and actually, I don't remember what state or what precinct this was, but during the Democratic primary, there was one place where they were verifying the vote. They were actually doing an audit of that. They weren't going to do the whole count, but they were doing an audit. You take a random sample of I don't know what percentage they were looking at, anywhere from 1 to 5%, and the audit was not in accordance with the electronic vote, and so what the election committee did was they altered the audit to correspond with the electronic vote. Well, what's the point in doing an audit if you're going to adjust the audit to comply with the electronic vote? That's absurd, but that's exactly what they did. I think it was Nevada, but I don't remember what it was.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's just the electoral process has got to.
And that's what they,
be verifiable,
with
or it's useless.
Yeah, and the reporting of elections has changed in order to accommodate electronic voting as well. It used to be that exit polls taken during the election were used by the news media to accurately predict the outcome of the election. Exit polls are considered the most accurate method of gauging what has just happened in an election, and they have been for forever. And in fact, the international commission that headed by Jimmy Carter, that goes around the world to verify the legitimacy of elections. That what they use is exit polls. They compare the end result with exit polls, and if the end result varies by more than, I think it's 2%, then they deem that it was an illegitimate election.
Right.
Because that is the nature of exit. All you're doing when you ask an exit poll is you're asking how people have voted. So that it removes all the variables that normal polling does before elections, because before elections you don't know who's actually going to vote, you don't know whether they're going to change their minds, there's all kinds of variables, but exit polls tell you how people who did vote voted, basically, and so they are historically extremely accurate. Suddenly, around the year 2000, when we started using electronic voting machines, exit polls started to vary from what was called the actual vote.
The actual vote, yes.
And what they did, the news media couldn't explain this, and so what they started doing was adjusting the exit poll data to match the actual vote
just like
data.
they did in that audit. Yes, exactly.
And so we're not getting an accurate picture of what actually happened. But if American elections were monitored by the International Election Commission, most of our elections would be deemed illegitimate.
Yes.
Apparently.
Apparently, yes.
Yeah. So Canada, Germany, other countries now use exclusively paper ballots that are hand counted for national elections, because they understand that electronic voting machines are not reliable and they can be hacked. This whole thing about the Russian involvement in our past election, it's still it's still being pushed in a way. I mean, what happened at that news conference with Trump and Putin was disgusting. You know.
Well, yeah, it was, but but it's theater.
Yeah.
And the another article I was reading, it was an analysis of MSNBC's reporting
Rachel Maddow,
over the last, well, not just Rachel, but the whole spectrum of MSNBC's reporting over the last year. And they have, the amount of attention they have given to Russiagate is astronomical compared to everything else. In terms of the attention they've given to Yemen, which is a human catastrophe, they have given Russiagate 490% more coverage than they have given to that humanitarian crisis in Yemen. In fact, they have barely mentioned Yemen within the last year, and all of their attention is focused here upon Russiagate. It's McCarthyism, if ever there was.
Yeah.
And it is playing into the hands of the oligarchy, but this is really a whole different discussion. But it is beautiful music to the Kochs and their whole entire network, because it is totally and completely distracting people from what that Koch industry is up to.
It is. It's a
And,
distraction.
And I mean, everybody needs to read Democracy in Chains by Nancy McLean. She has done extensive research on the beginnings of this organized effort to place our democracy in chains, and it goes back to the board versus Brown versus the Board of Education, and the roots of this really began at the University of Virginia in the economics department with an economist who most of us have never heard of, even though he has a Nobel Prize in economics. His name is James Buchanan, and he has the founding theory of free markets, and he was brought into the fold of the Koch industry, and he was funded by the Kochs. His theory of free market economics, which essentially is that free markets should have absolutely no constraints upon them. I mean, zero. I mean, he was a radical, and he meant no restraints from government on any kind.
Basic
of
libertarian
economic
philosophy.
Libertarians, no, this is more radical than libertarians. I mean, they...
Well, Ayn Rand was pretty much what you're describing.
He's more radical than Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand looks like a saint compared to this guy. And he left the University of West Virginia, went to Virginia Tech because of conflicts within the university, because his work was not scholarly. I mean, he has this theory, and he has this free market theory with really essentially no research to back it up. Mm-hmm. So he left Virginia
Which is
Tech.
typical of a libertarian.
Yeah, and then this all actually goes back to an Austrian school called Mount, I think it's Pelier or something like that. Anyway, it's a society that they met at this mountain, and a lot of wealthy people met there, and they started forming these theories that the economy, that the problems that that the whole humanitarian issue that we have is all because of constraints upon the economy. And so all constraints have to be lifted. So that means that property is paramount. Human life is subservient to property. The environment is subservient to property. Nothing matters. Everything that takes precedence is property. And if you look into this theory, that's exactly what it is. And this octopus that sprang from this man's studies, which is what the Kochs have based everything that the Cato Foundation, the Heritage Foundation, ALEC, the
American Legislative Exchange Council.
American Legislative Exchange Council, SPIN, State Public State Policy Network. Mm-hmm. All of those things, plus Civitas, and then they've got state organizations all over the states. All of these tentacles come from this man, and who eventually ended up at George Mason University, which is just across the river from the Capitol. And so they developed this whole educational system, and by the mid-1990s, 2 out of every 5 federal judge had gone through their postgraduate summer program at George Mason University. And if you remember the election of 1992, the midterm election of 1992, when the Republicans swept the House, the Senate.
Right. It was 2 years after Clinton was elected.
After Clinton was elected.
Right.
And you remember a person named Army, who was the...
Dick Armey?
Dick Armey.
He was a senator.
He was, yes. He was a graduate of George Mason. And so George Mason has this economic department and a law school. All of them founded deeply in this free market concept. Mm-hmm. They have infiltrated every aspect of government. The judiciary, the House, and the Senate. Mm-hmm. Just as you just look at in 2010, look at all of that legislation all across the states that was proposed and in many places put into place to limit elections.
Mm-hmm. Gerrymandering
and the gerrymandering in 2010.
In Texas and North Carolina and many other states.
And many other states.
Yeah.
And
voter ID laws.
And voter ID laws.
Right.
All of that came out of that school, and it all really began with at the University of Virginia.
And this sounds like a terrible conspiracy theory, but it's not. This actually happened.
It actually
where ALEC came into the states, and I remember when they came to North Carolina,
mm-hmm.
They essentially funded the Koch brothers and ALEC poured hundreds or 100,000 or millions of dollars into electing key legislators. Mm-hmm. And taking over the House and the Senate in North Carolina. This happened. Right in this district, Jim Davis all of a sudden had over $1 million
mm-hmm.
to spend in dark money, essentially from the Koch brothers, mm-hmm. and
Meadows.
And Meadows, right? And well, they redistricted Meadows' district so that he couldn't lose anyway. But they essentially gerrymandered
and Clampett.
And what?
Clampett.
And Clampett, right. Jim Davis in our district, District
mm-hmm.
50, the state Senate,
mm-hmm.
had like over $1 million to spend in a district where typically $20,000 would get spent. Snow didn't have a chance, you know, and the Democrats got caught by surprise throughout the state by all of this money all of a sudden, and couldn't compete, and the Republicans for the first time in 150 years took over the North Carolina General Assembly and passed all of this
retrograde legislation.
crazy legislation, including legislation that denied climate change, and this was happening all over the country, especially in red states that had been taken over. And it's important to go back into those roots that you're talking about and understand where this was a plan, and this is not a secret even. I mean, this was a plan by essentially a libertarian think tank. And let's look at that a little bit. You know, the libertarian philosophy. You know, it's a great name. Whoever thought of the word libertarian? It sounds so benign and wonderful, but it's essentially a social Darwinistic philosophy, where they believe in this hierarchy of humanity, and the people who are most successful economically are at the top of that hierarchy and should control. That the people who are workers were born to be workers, and the wisdom and strength should all be from the top down.
Absolutely.
That's the libertarian philosophy, and nothing should interfere with that, because that is the natural way of things.
Absolutely.
That is the social Darwinistic libertarian philosophy. They should control all the gold. It should be a gold standard that we live by. And the government should not interfere with anything, including advocating for human rights, and
Absolutely.
and which is at the basis of our Constitution, you know, which is government of, by, and for the people. That goes counter to the social Darwinistic libertarian philosophy, and they have so much money to put into this. The Koch brothers.
And they are, and they have been. I mean, it is. The Koch brothers are singular in their strategy, and they have been working this for decades and decades. They have lots of money, and they have poured tons and tons of money into manipulating our democracy, and they have become the masters of manipulation. They have couched
what they do.
They have couched all of this in terms of freedom, and they have couched all of this in terms of peaceful society. If you go to the SPAN homepage, you will see right there, freedom and liberty and peaceful society. But what they mean by freedom is freedom for exactly the people that you're talking about. They mean freedom from nobody else. Freedom for that 1% that is, I mean, they are solid and firm that that's who deserves freedom. They do not think anyone else deserves freedom. And you can go to the SPIN page. It's State Policy Network, and it's part of the Koch network. They have it in every single state now, and they're doing policy for all of our legislators. That's where our General Assembly is getting all of their support is from SPIN. I don't know. It's ironic to me that their acronym is SPIN. Because they are, I don't know if this was intentional or not, but anyway, they are the spin doctors of the universe.
And what does SPIN stand for? Do we know?
State Policy Network, SPN. I don't know if they call it SPIN or not, but that's what That's what's been
And to be
spelled.
fair, it's not just the Koch brothers. I mean,
No, it's not.
It's
Alec-
Art Pope in North Carolina as well.
Alec is not. Alec was founded by the Cato Foundation and
Yeah.
Heritage Foundation, and all of the graduates from George Mason. When George Mason, this was in the 80s, that George Mason founded their graduate school, the late 80s, and Koch's had an institute in California. I think it was called Study of Humanities or something like that. Their names are so misleading. Anyway, they moved that institution to George Mason, and they established this postgraduate program and a doctoral program. Their first year, they had 200 recruits, and they were cherry picking. This was not an open enrollment institution, but they have used. George Mason is a public institution of the University of West Virginia system, and so they have used George Mason to place all of this private entity and encase it in a public university. I haven't watched MSNBC in a very long time, but when I was watching it regularly, they continuously had commentators coming on there from George Mason University.
Yeah.
This is supposedly the liberal station, and they
not anymore. Yeah.
They continuously had a string of people from George Mason.
They kicked out all the liberal guys and put in conservative people. Yeah.
Anyway, I haven't watched it in a long time. I don't know what's going on there. But anyway, one of in Nancy McLean's concluding remarks in Democracy in Chains, she was talking to one of her mentors who said who had helped her actually with this study on James Buchanan. She said, am I just imagining things? This is just so crazy. This just isn't right. And she said, and her mentor said to her, who had been following Buchanan all of his life, she said, what you have to realize is that the neoliberals have never looked at the theory. And I mean, I don't know if the Clintons and Obama are that naive, but the roots of what is going on with this Coke industry, they know that they could never bring this agenda forward if the public knew what they were doing. So it has always been a stealth operation. They knew that if they went in and immediately destroyed that social safety net, I mean, they've been after Social Security since Social Security was founded.
They're incrementally destroying it.
They knew that they could never accomplish that the people would never stand for what they're doing. So they have incrementally gone in. One of their primary ways of operating is privatization of the public common. So so the Clintons, the Obamas, what have they done? They have bought into that privatization.
Yes, they have.
Where did Obama get his start in Chicago?
As a state legislator.
Well, I mean, before that. He went to Chicago as what? A community organizer?
Community organizer, yeah.
What did he do as a community organizer?
I don't know.
Public-private partnerships was his sole purpose as a community organizer. He privatized the public housing project. Put thousands of people out of their homes.
I didn't know that.
And so, anyway, this mentor said the neoliberals have never looked at the theory. But I'm thinking, the Clintons and Obama are brilliant people. Natively, they're much more brilliant than I am.
And they're taking a lot of money from them. Oh, yeah, no, I don't think there's anything naive about
to
that.
think that they're that naive, I just cannot buy that. But, I mean, even you look at the Clinton Foundation, their whole model
Yes.
is privatization. when they go into these disaster areas, they're not funneling that money into infrastructures to help correct whatever happened there. They funnel all of their money into private entities that contract with governments. None of it goes directly to the public. And Obama wanted his legacy to be the passing of the TPP.
Right.
And Hillary was all on board on that until Bernie came along, and she had to change her stance, and people said, well, she backed off of that. She didn't actually support it. She never said she didn't support it. She said, the way it's worded now, I can't support it.
Right, but she also said that after it was apparent that it was going to lose. I mean,
Yeah.
she took no political risk
Exactly.
at that point.
Yeah.
But it became clear to me where Hillary Clinton was coming from when she remained silent on Standing Rock, and could not. She did not have the ability to speak out against the fossil fuel industry, even in the face of abhorrent, human rights violations rivaling what happened in Selma, Alabama. I mean, in the 1960s, she could not speak up and say stop the abuse, because she couldn't. She didn't have the ability to confront the fossil fuel industry because she was taking so much money from that industry, and so it, there's very little difference that I can see between the corporate Republicans and the corporate Democrats. They're essentially on the same team. And getting back to our original conversation, Vladimir Putin is on the same team.
Yeah, probably is.
I mean, Russia is no longer a communist country.
Right.
Russia is now a capitalist country, and the same interests that have taken over the United States and the United States government have taken over Russia.
Absolutely.
Essentially, it's an international mafia of international corporations that are working together with the fossil fuel industry, the pharmaceutical industry, you name it, I think the American people have to realize that we don't have control of our government. This is not
and just because just because Russia is an oligarchy like the United States is, doesn't mean that there's cohesion there. I mean, throughout history, oligarchies have been fighting amongst
themselves. Sure.
I mean, look, you can go back to the Bible. I mean, Ishmael formed an army against his father David. Mm. I mean, the oligarchy.
His father Abraham.
No.
Ishmael was Abraham's son. Yes.
Okay, so who was David's son?
Isaac and Ishmael.
Oh, that's right. Okay, so who was David's son that formed the army against him? What was his name?
The descendant of Ishmael?
No, it was David's son.
No, Abraham was Ishmael and
that's right.
And Isaac's.
And Isaac, yeah. And
father.
So
yes, and then
who was David's son, the handicapped fella?
Isaac.
No, David's son.
Oh, David's son was.
He's handicapped. And
you mean King David's son?
Yeah, King David. Yeah.
That came much later.
I know. Yes, it did come much later when there was actually an oligarchy in Israel.
Yeah, that Solomon maybe, or I'm not sure. Saul.
No.
All right.
Anyway,
yeah.
Anyway, so I mean, it's been going on a long time. I mean, and kings their children and brothers and sisters assassinated one another. So the oligarchy has always been fighting amongst itself. So, I mean, just because the Kochs have a tight hold on this doesn't mean that the Rothschilds love the Kochs. And
right. Right. No, that's right. There are wars going on between the oligarchs as well. But what unifies the oligarchs is in keeping the people down.
Yes, that unifies them.
Yeah.
And so that is, to me, I mean, Russia Gate. What we really should be looking at is our electoral process and the integrity of that. Mm-hmm. But what Russiagate is really distracting us from, and Donald Trump is distracting us from, is exactly what is going on behind the scenes. And going back to Donald Trump's cabinet, probably 90% of them are graduates of George Mason postgraduate program.
And it's gone beyond George Mason University now.
But George Mason is the cover. It's a public institution.
Okay, but what the Kochs are doing now is they're going around the country and donating large sums of money to various universities in exchange for changing the curriculum of those universities. As much, like here in Cullowhee, the deal was, when there was a big controversy about this, they donated a building to the university, to Western Carolina University, and what they wanted in exchange was that courses would be taught in Ayn Rand. And when word got out about that, there was a big revolt among the faculty and people in the state, and they were forced to take that out of the curriculum because there's nothing scholarly about Ayn Rand. It's very shallow, undocumented, unresearched, a very shallow philosophy, really. It's based on ignorance and hatred and social Darwinism, which any scientific study of social Darwinism shows that there's no scientific basis for its premise. So this is being, even though they were not successful at getting Ayn Rand taught at Western Carolina University, they have been successful at many other universities, and they were successful here in teaching courses which still promote that basic philosophy, but not under the name of Ayn Rand. It's insidious.
It's James Buchanan's philosophy. They may have called it Ayn Rand, but they're actually using James Buchanan. It's George Mason is the core of this, but they are spreading it all across the nation, and they are trying to infiltrate the whole entire system. And the voucher program, which began in Virginia,
is an outgrowth of that.
After Brown versus the Board of Education, Virginia instituted the voucher process. Virginia, after the passage of Brown versus the Board of Education, attempted to privatize their whole entire educational system. And that's when the voucher program started, and they were funneling public funds to private institutions so that white children could go to private institutions and the black children had no place to go. There was one county, Prince Edward, in Virginia, where black students had no place to go to school for 3 entire years because there was no public school, and all of that public money was going to private institutions. This is another way that they're trying to privatize the public common. They hate public schools. They hate Social Security, and they hate public schools. Social Security is the backbone of the social program that we have in the United States. And public schools are the backbones of communities. And public schools teach about community. They despise that. And they want to destroy the public education system. And DeVos, that is her job, that's what she's there to do,
Yeah.
is to absolutely destroy the public education system. They've been working on this systemically and intentionally.
Yes.
since-
And unapologetically.
And unapologetically.
Yeah.
And they call it, always they couch this in terms of freedom.
Right.
Voucher programs are choice. It's the freedom to choose. That is their mantra.
Right.
And they have no intention of that being a democratic choice.
No.
It is a choice for the wealthy to send their children to private schools. That's all it has. That's
Yeah.
all it's about.
In an attempt to keep a cheap labor pool available by keeping a population uneducated, a
Absolutely.
certain population
Yes.
uneducated, so that they're available for cheap labor.
They really do not care what happens to the rest of the population.
Yeah.
I mean, sure, they need some labor force to maintain their lifestyle,
Right.
but they don't care if the rest of the population dies and goes away. They really do not care.
Which they don't, but it's very short-sighted on their part. I mean, because ultimately they're going to find that if there's the more poverty that exists and the less money the population has to spend money, it's going to come around and hurt the economy and their own businesses as well.
I don't think they really care. I mean, they've got enough
Well, I don't think
wealth.
they realize that.
They've got enough wealth that it doesn't matter if
Well-
the economy crashes. They don't care if the economy crashes.
Well, but again, money is a representation of real value,
Mm-hmm.
and if the real value, if there's not enough food, if farmers go out of business and they can't grow food, it doesn't matter how much money they have, they're not going to be able to eat.
They'll have sufficient farmers to feed themselves
Maybe, I don't know if they will.
with all of the lands and farms that they own. I mean,
Yeah, well, if you don't have the migrant workers to farm, to harvest those crops.
they'll have enough workers to harvest for themselves. I mean,
I don't know.
look at the Middle Ages. I mean, that's where they want to go back to, is serfdom.
It's feudalism.
Yes, feudalism or
Well-
serfdom, yes. That is exactly
And you find
what
that the
they say.
feudalism isn't what it's cut out, what it used to be.
Yeah, they don't care about.
Well, I think you're right, they don't care, but they should, because,
From your perspective, yes.
and if they were smart enough to understand the way the world works in general, they'll find out that what goes around comes around. You know, they are still part of humanity as much as they'd like to think they're above it all.
They're above it all, yes.
Yeah, they're not in reality above it all. They are still flesh and blood, and they are still dependent on the environment. You know, they and their children are going to suffer the consequences of climate change unless we reverse what they are doing. You know, if there's a famine, they will feel it. You know, they'll be the last ones to feel it.
Yeah.
But they will feel it. If there's a nuclear war, they are not going to escape the radiation. You know, they can go into an underground hole for a certain amount of time if all the mechanisms they think are going to work do work. You know, but it's a very short-sighted
Right.
philosophy that they have, and it's based in ignorance. It's not based in reality.
I agree, but
Yeah. Anyway.
but they really, their end game is putting democracy in chains, and privatization is one way they're chipping away at it. And And the other way is, of course, through legislation. What they really, the end game that they really want is to, our Constitution, there was a recent study done, looking at democracies across the world and comparing them in terms of how democratic they are. The United States has never really been one of the paramount leaders in terms of democracy, in terms of actually providing democracy to the vast majority of the people. And
any gains we've had have been won by fighting against the system.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's what this study was pointing out, that most democracies have about 2 points of veto. In the United States, we have 4 points of veto. We have the president, the Senate, and the courts, and the protection of private property, which our Constitution has always been based upon the protection of property, really essentially over human lives. That was all part of that compromise, essentially, with the slave states and the free states, was the protection of property, even human property. And so the Kochs are wanting to strengthen and are working and have been successful in strengthening those veto powers. But you look at the Senate. That is one primary point of extraordinarily undemocratic veto. North Dakota has as much veto power as California has voting power. California has 490% more population than North Dakota, and North Dakota carries exactly the same voting power in the Senate that California does. Extraordinarily undemocratic.
Yes.
And we're about the only leading democracy that has that sort of non-representation in terms, and a body that has extraordinary power. And if you look back through our history, the House was ready to pass the civil rights legislation 30 years before it was ever passed, and it was vetoed by the Senate consistently throughout that period of time.
And it's getting more and more disparate in that way. It's projected that I think in 10 years that 8 states.
The other veto, I'm sorry, is the Electoral College.
Well, the Electoral College certainly is similar to the Senate, but in 10 years, 8 states, and North Carolina is one of those 8 states, will have about 70% of the population of the United States of America. Or 70% of the entire population will be concentrated in 8 states. In 8 states, which means that the other 42 states will have
the veto power over 70% of the population.
Exactly. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Extremely undemocratic, and the Electoral College likewise is undemocratic, and in fact,
it was intended to be that way, and it is.
So, the 2000 presidential election and now the 2016 presidential election were decided by the Electoral College rather than the popular vote. And that's happened now, I think, 5 times in American history in which the president was not elected by a majority of the people. That's one of the many injustices that needs to be corrected in our electoral system.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So anyway, in our elections, this process, Price is a wonderful candidate. His real opponent is not Meadows. His real opponent is Civitas, and the whole
Civitas.
Civitas. I don't know how they pronounce it. I don't care. Anyway, it's them, Pope, and the Kochs. That is
And
the real.
Duke Energy, I'd put them in there too.
That's all part of the same oligarchy.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the opponent is. Even I don't know, because I haven't really investigated this. I don't know where Mao's money is coming from.
Chairman Mao.
Chairman Mao.
It's so funny.
His billboards all over this county are
Yeah.
not coming out of his bucket. I don't imagine.
That's true. Where is that money coming from?
I expect it is coming from.
It may be coming from him. He might have deep pockets. I don't know.
It might be other wealthy people in the county are supporting.
And what's his slogan at the bottom is people, not politics.
People, not politics. Yeah.
Yeah. What the hell does that mean? But,
yeah. That means.
Yeah. That means
that
politics, not people.
That means people are going to get the shaft. That's what it means.
Right. That's what it means.
That means, yes, that's exactly what it means.
Yeah. If he wins, I don't know. I'm not sure that advertising himself as Chairman Mao is going to win him many votes in Western North Carolina.
I don't know how many people outside of our age group are even going to make that connection.
Oh, I think it's pretty plain. Yeah. I think most people will know who Mao was.
I don't know.
But that's, I think it's funny, but at the same time it's not so funny. I mean, yeah.
But yeah, I'm sure there is dark money throughout the electoral process. So, but I do think of course, the issue is getting the word out. If Price gets the word out, he will win the election. I have friends on all sides of the spectrum. I have some really conservative friends who consistently vote Republican and have all of their lives, and they wouldn't think of voting any other way. And they have said to me that they don't like Donald Trump, but he's going to run again in 2020, and they will probably vote for him unless Bernie Sanders actually
Isn't that interesting?
runs. And this is what one of my friends said to me: if Sanders runs, I am going to have to vote for him. She said have to. She doesn't want to because he's
And this is a
not
conservative Republican.
This is an extraordinarily conservative Republican.
And this is not, people talk about, in Vermont where Sanders has now run statewide elections about, I think, 8 times now. He ran for Congress, and he was Vermont only has 1 Congress.
Oh, okay.
And they have 2 senators, because that's the way it's set up. And now, every time Sanders has won, he's won with 70%, 72% of the vote. And the reason he's won such a high percentage of the vote, Vermont is not traditionally a liberal state.
Yeah.
Or a democratic state. It has historically been a Republican state. But Sanders consistently wins, as an independent, an overwhelming majority of the Democratic vote, and 20 to 25% of the Republican vote. And he runs unabashedly as a democratic socialist. And so you have to wonder. And so people say, well, that's Vermont, liberals. No, Vermont is not a liberal state. Vermont is a traditionally very conservative rural state. The reason they like Bernie Sanders, and the reason all over the country,
he's the
people,
most popular politician in the country.
He's in the country, is because they like his honesty and his integrity, and they understand that he is not bought and paid for.
And the issues are what they like.
Yeah.
They want what he stands for.
Yeah, and an overwhelming number, this is another thing, very interesting point, is that where people will define, if you ask someone, are you a liberal or conservative, they'll say, I'm a conservative.
Mm-hmm.
But if you ask those same people, well, do you think that Social Security is a good program? Oh, yes, I love Social Security. Do you think Medicare is a good? Oh, yes, we love Medicare. And if you go up and down the list of issues, including abortion, and so many other things, Medicare for all, some 60 to 70% of the American people say side on the liberal.
Yes. Interesting.
Side of the issues, but if you ask them about how they label themselves, they label themselves as conservatives.
Yeah.
Which means that there's a great confusion in the American public about
what is liberal and conservative.
What is liberal and conservative, and what and there should be, in a sense, because people who are considered liberal are people who are strong on the environment generally,
mm-hmm.
people who believe in that we have to take care of the poor, and in a sense, in the true dictionary sense of the word conservative, we are the conservatives. Mm-hmm. These are conservative values. We believe in steady as you go. Take care of everybody, make sure that everybody is taken care of and everything is taken care of so that we can maintain continuity. Mm-hmm. Those who are labeling themselves as conservative today are the radicals. They're calling for radical change. They're calling for radical, differentiation between the rich and the poor, and they're calling for instability, so things are turned on their heads, and so, I'm a conservative.
Well, yeah, liberal and conservative are manufactured labels, and actually James Buchanan started out labeling himself as a neoliberal. Changed that title to conservative very, very early on because liberals had become associated with the social safety nets and things like that. So he changed that rhetoric fairly early on. But anyway, it's the liberal-conservative divide is a manufactured divide, and it's part of that whole cult plan is a dualistic division of people. I mean, if you go to the Tea Party rallies, what are they? They're screaming about. They're screaming about the parasites, which is anybody but themselves. Many of the if you go to a Tea Party convention, or a rally, many of those people are on Social Security, disability, food stamps, and then they are turning around and screaming at the people who are scamming the system. They're
the ones who...
No, they know they're legitimately on these programs, but to them those are legitimate programs and they're legitimately on it. It's just everybody else who's scamming the system. And we've got to do something about all of those.
Mostly they're talking about black and brown people.
Yes,
they see those. Yes. Those are the ones that are scamming the system. The white people who run the system need to be on the system.
And those immigrants who aren't even on those programs, but
who are threatening us by taking jobs that we would never want.
That we would never want to, and they're scamming the system because they're on Social Security and Medicare, and they're getting all this free health care, and that's total and complete baloney because they're not eligible.
Right.
But they are convinced that all of these immigrants are getting all of these benefits.
Yeah.
When it's total and complete
Well, this has been a great conversation. I thought we were going to be talking about Russia, but
Yes, well,
it's all tied in together.
It's all tied in together. I mean, Russia is. I mean, I know the Kochs are loving this Russia Gate thing. I just know this is wonderful. It helps us to work behind the scenes to.
And it's a great diversion. Again, the news media is scaring up a war with Russia, or at least another Cold War, if not a hot, risking a hot war, in order to divert from the rigged political system that we have.
I mean, I can't see an all-out war with Russia. I mean, I'm not really afraid of that. But there's going to be all kinds of skirmishes within vulnerable countries, like there was throughout the Cold War. And it's going to be vulnerable countries who are going to be suffering tremendously from ratcheting up this thing between us and Russia.
Yeah.
I mean, Russia and the United States have way too much to lose to have a nuclear annihilation. Nobody has anything to gain. And economically, we're too intertwined. People may not want to believe that, but we have.
With Russia. Certainly. I think that's true. And the European Union and Russia and the United States and Saudi Arabia, it's all sort of one big economic global system right now.
But where we're going to see these places like Yemen, I mean, Russia's going to take one side, the United States is going to take another, and destroy Yemen in the process.
Yeah, many poor people will suffer around the world.
Yeah.
And it's true. And in terms of what's happening with Trump now, I think that the Republicans are genuinely getting frightened about the Trump presidency.
Yes.
And they may end up removing him from office, or he may die mysteriously, or something like that. And they would much rather see, I think, Mike Pence in power right now, because he doesn't really represent the change in policy from Trump.
No, he would ratchet down on that. It would be terrible to have Mike Pence in there, because he's not a total complete buffoon.
But he's not a loose cannon in the same way that Trump is. So I think
the Kochs didn't provide political support to Trump or to Clinton. They stayed out of that pretty much.
Yeah.
But David Koch was at Trump's inauguration, and they've had tremendous amount of influence in his cabinet, and almost everybody in his cabinet has been through the Koch Institute in one way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
So he's very muchly embedded in the Koch thing. They don't like it, but like we said earlier, there's lots of infighting within the oligarchy. Always has been.
And the Democrats, meanwhile, are going to do everything they can to keep the progressive wing down in the Democratic Party, and you can see that happening. And that's I think where the soul of America is being fought for right now, is within the Democratic Party, between the progressive wing and the corporatist Democrats.
Yeah, the Coke industry has such a stranglehold on the Republican Party. I don't see how they can come back from it.
Right.
I'm hoping that the Democratic Party can come back from it. I don't see much hope otherwise.
Well, and what was it? Yeah, and what was interesting in New York, where Cortez won and beat what was his name?
I forget his name, but anyway.
Crowley. They beat Crowley, who was the fourth most powerful Democrat in Congress. And now there are moves by the Democrats being made. I see Lieberman came out and his support is telling Crowley to run as a third-party candidate, because his name's going to be on the ballot under the Working Families Party, even though the Working Families Party has asked him to get off the ballot.
from what I understand, he can't.
Oh, he can. There are ways he can do it by moving out of the district,
He doesn't live in a district.
or by changing his residence so that he's not in the district.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a
does.
legal mechanism by
Yeah.
which he can do that. He can also change, run for an office a different office, and then deny, say. But he's refusing to do that. He's kind of keeping his options
Keeps
open.
his options open. He's going to be slaughtered. So
One would hope so. One would hope that the Democrats won't divide the vote and then the Republican will get in. But I think the Democrats would rather that happen than allow Cortez
they would.
to
I'm
be
sure,
seated.
I'm sure they would.
And so that's a little scary. And we also saw a revolution in Maryland where Ben Jealous won the Democratic gun, and Ben Jealous was on Bernie Sanders' inner team. So it's very interesting to see this dynamic.
Did a week after the 14th district where Cortez won?
Yeah.
She won in the 15th district.
Yeah. As a reform candidate.
As a write-in, and she made no pretense of running in that election.
She won. She didn't win the Democratic primary. She won the Reform Party.
Oh, the Reform Party.
Yeah, and there were only like 20 votes or something like that. But that was funny. Anyway, yeah, it's very. I think that in a level playing field, the progressives will win across the country.
They will. Yeah.
But of course, it's not a level playing field. The corporate Democrats are putting millions of dollars into defeating progressive candidates, even at the expense of losing to Republicans, because they feel closer to the Republicans than they do to the progressive Democrats. Nonetheless, I think that progressives are going to win this fight because, call me an eternal optimist, if you will, but because of the up-and-coming generation of voters is overwhelmingly, like 80% progressive in the Democratic Party.
And just like you mentioned, when you poll the whole country, the country is liberal.
Yeah.
And it's not just within the Democratic Party. I mean, if you run on the issues,
right,
and the election is not rigged.
Yeah.
If you run on the issues, you're going to win the elections.
Right, so it's a very interesting dynamic that's happening in this country right now. There is the window of opportunity to gain democracy back in our system, even against these powerful forces.
Well, these powerful forces, their fear is the people.
Yeah.
And their whole strategy has been to stifle democracy because their fear is the people.
Yeah.
So I hope you're right, and I am trying to be optimistic about it as well. And over the last year, in special elections and primaries across the country, it has been progressives that have been winning. Progressives who have been campaigning on the issues.
And I prefer to look at myself not as an optimist, but as a possibilist.
As a possibilist. Yes.
So, in other words, an optimist is just an observer. We're not observers. We're capable of exercising our personal power, and we have something to say about how it turns out. And I think that's what we have to do. Is we can't be observers in the political system. We have to be activists. We have to be participating in the political system and make it happen.
The Popular Resistance School, we've gone way over time here, but the Popular Resistance School, in some of the research that they have, not that they have necessarily undertaken, but some of the research that they have looked into, and research that has looked at social movements throughout the centuries, what they have discovered is that anytime there is a solidarity of 3.5% of the population. That's all it takes.
Hmm.
No dictatorship, no authoritarian state throughout history has been able to withstand a solidarity movement with only 3.5% of the population.
I
And sometimes
believe
it's
that,
been less
yeah.
than that.
I believe that. That's a powerful force. I mean,
That's a powerful force.
3.5, that's like, that's, in this country, it's 1 million people.
Uh-huh.
1 million people acting in concert is an irresistible force.
Yeah, because the 1% does not have those numbers.
Right.
They-
And nobody else does.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they can't withstand it. So that has been the goal of the Kochs, is to put democracy in chains.
And divide us everywhere.
That's
And
part
divide
of-
us
that's-
between black and white and brown and upper and lower class, and every way they can imagine, try to divide us.
And you can see their strategy in their Social Security movement.
Yeah.
They guarantee the people who are 65 and older that nothing's going to change for them, and those who are 55 and older, those who are going into the system, we're not going to change anything for you. But it's going to change for those who are under 55 years old. And so what they're doing with those under 55 years old is they're putting the seed into their minds that everything they're paying in, so first of all, they undermine Social Security. It's not solvent. We've really got to do something to take care of Social Security. It's not solvent. You really can't rely on this. So that's the message to everybody under 55.
Right.
So everybody under 55 is paying into a system that they'll never be able to take advantage of. And so what do? They look at all of us old codgers and say, you're taking money out of our pockets. So they've got the young and the old against one
Right.
another. The other group that they have in opposition to this is, of course, the wealthy people who have no desire and no need for Social Security. They want to wipe it out. So they've got...
Yeah, because they're paying, they see it as them paying for it.
They see them as paying for it. So, and the employer is paying into Social Security as well. So they've got all of these groups fighting against one another. And what's the solution? Let's privatize Social Security. So you can see this strategy. Everywhere you look, you can see there's a strategy. And they've been working it. And part of the strategy is certainly division.
Well, Alan, we've gone way over time, which is
That's
fine. This has been a great conversation. Thank you for coming, and let's continue this conversation.
Yeah.
Maybe get some other people to join us as well in the future. But I think this has to be an ongoing conversation. Things are changing so rapidly in this country right now, and we're in such a state of flux. And again, we can have influence over where it goes from here, but we can't just stand by and watch it happen. And so, for those of you who are still tuned in, at 9:30 we'll be watching our feature presentation for today, which is part 4 of the Rain River Fish and Faucet Forum held in Franklin last month. This chapter is called Charting a Future for Water-Based Recreation in Western North Carolina. So stay tuned for that, and you can view the rest of today's schedule on mountainstream.tv. Thanks for watching. Have a great day, and we will see you